but I couldn't help but wonder, presumably that the book was written before COVID, if this pandemic has in any way changed your position or reinforced your position or altered your position anyway.
Yeah, so, well, just as like a funny sociological note, we wrote this book starting in 2016 for obvious reasons, like after the US election and the Brexit vote. We tried to write it and publish it quickly because we were like, we got to do this now while misinformation is really relevant. And it's like a sad situation that like turned out to have some staying power. So for like regarding the COVID pandemic, I mean, I think a lot of the like misinformation and disinformation we're seeing is of a type with stuff we had seen before. There have been a couple things that have emerged during it that like either are like well explained or track previous work, or we've been like analyzing using newer work. So we're still continuing. Now we have like another grant and are still doing misinformation research, like new misinformation research. So one thing that we talk about in the book are these like belief faction models where you end up with groups that have like multiple polarized beliefs, and these can emerge kind of endogenously because people ground their trust on multiple beliefs that other people have. So when you share information with me, I might take into account a lot of different beliefs you have in deciding, are you a trustworthy person? And we show that when you're doing that, you can end up with people being polarized on these different beliefs, and there can be no real ideological connection, no reason for these beliefs to group together, but they nonetheless become grouped together and become almost signals of group identity and get correlated with each other. So one thing we've been talking about since the pandemic started is polarization in the US over COVID-related beliefs and how well a lot of that polarization fits that model. So for example, in the US, there's been a huge amount of polarization. Now it's dying down, but over the drug hydroxychloroquine, because Donald Trump, promoted this drug a lot, and it was sort of under-vetted while he was doing that. But then as a result, liberals became extremely skeptical of it, like to the degree that they were treating it as a hoax, even though it was being used pretty widely by doctors and looked like a promising therapy at that time. And conservatives became like very convinced that it was the miracle cure, even though it was not. It had not been proven to be that. And that was a situation where we were like, well, we're seeing polarization, but it's just a bizarre belief to be polarized. And there's no reason it fits with any kind of conservative or liberal ideology. And furthermore, the drug remdesivir kind of became like the liberal drug a little bit, but there's just nothing about these beliefs that is explained by like, well, that's the kind of thing conservatives believe or liberals believe. So we thought that tracked very well this kind of model where people are adopting beliefs because of who they trust rather than inherent features of the beliefs. So that's been like one COVID related thing that we kind of attached to the book work. And then we've also been talking a lot about like a more recent model that I worked on with a couple co-authors, looking at the retraction of scientific information and why it fails. And that's been super relevant during COVID because there have been so many studies that came out, were spread really widely on social media. They were published kind of quickly, and then they were retracted. And the retraction didn't always like get out there all the way. It was not necessarily the case that everyone learned this idea has now been refuted or reversed. So those are a couple things that like have come up because of COVID related to this.
Is it interesting watching, sorry, just a quick follow-up question, interesting watching the scientific process play out in real time in the public eye, which is not usually something that happens. It kind of happens behind closed doors and then it gets published, but we're seeing it happen in real time, and I think it's like fueling public distrust in science almost. Would you say that?
Yeah, it's hard to know about the distrust factor, but I think this thing where there keep being results that get published, then criticized, then reversed, and it's all happening in the public eye, where normally that would happen during peer review or possibly, between lab groups, but before the public knows that much about it, it has been weird and different, right? It's not something that's usually happening. I mean, it's in part because all these journalists are scouring preprint archives for things to write articles about related to COVID. And usually they would wait for peer review and publication, but because COVID is so relevant and the research is going so fast, instead they're, you know, widely writing about and publicizing this stuff that's hasn't even been printed yet. Sorry, I'm just moving my phone.
No worries. Yeah, so that raises for me a question about what I've been calling like meta trust recently, which is trusting people to tell you who to trust. Because that seems like a big problem with what's going on nowadays, is that once you start, say, trusting Donald Trump, he tells you, well, you can't trust X, you can't trust Y, you can't trust Z, and you should trust Fox, and you should trust Hannity or whatever. Or if you start trusting, Maggie Haberman, and she tells you, okay, well, these people in the White House are trustworthy and those ones aren't, then you end up sort of going down that route. And so you end up in this position where you're not just polarizing on propositions, like is this proposition true or false, but on who you can trust to tell you who you can trust. Any thoughts about that?
Another way of saying, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Maybe another way of framing it is like outsourcing, like maybe as a heuristic, like it's easier to look at, consider someone's authoritative take on who to trust, because that like is a quick shortcut rather than giving credence to propositions or something.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's like an insightful thing to bring up, because there's all this evidence that people do have these heuristics where it's easier to just think this is a trustworthy source than I'm going to do all the work to try to figure out for every proposition.
Which is natural and
right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Regarding this idea of meta trust, Mark, like one thing that's kind of interesting that I hadn't thought about before. So in our polarization models, you get groups polarizing over matters of fact. You also actually get them polarizing over who is trustworthy, where one group agrees that all the people in this group are trustworthy and not those people, and the other group the same, or they treat them as if they are and aren't trustworthy in that polarized way. I hadn't thought about this like polarization over sources idea. That's really interesting, in part because so, one thing that we do a little bit in the book that I've thought about more later is trying to almost list, here are the different social driving forces that are all kind of sufficient on their own to lead to polarization. And so in any case, it's a question of was it one of these sources or multiple of them? And one is just different informational sources where you just have persistently different informational sources. Like all these people are just listening to Fox, all these people just MSNBC or whatever, and that's going to keep polarization as long as you don't get the cross pollination of ideas. And that it sounds like you're talking about what can drive the process whereby people just end up having these different informational channels coming to them.
Yeah, I think that's worth exploring, because some of your sources will just tell you sort of what they think about first order issues. They'll just say I think proposition P is true and Q is false. But in many cases, they also promote or disparage other potential sources that you might be listening to. And I recently read this book by Joachim Benkler and a couple of his colleagues called Network Propaganda, where they show that it's really good. They show in particular that Fox is consistently going around telling people not to trust the mainstream media. And actually several years ago now, I think it was in 2016, I wrote a paper looking at, or a chapter looking at, you know, the novel 1984. And one of the things that happens in 1984 is that Big Brother is constantly telling you who you can and cannot trust, to tell you the truth or tell you falsehoods. So it seems to me like this is consistent with the kinds of models that you and Weatherall have explored, but that it's maybe like sort of supercharging things, because you're simultaneously getting signals about the proposition in question and about the source, and that could speed up the polarization.
Yeah, that seems right. And it also, like, it connects with you know, propaganda techniques, whereby we know people try to shape the reputation of certain sources to make them seem legitimate or non-legitimate, trustworthy or non-trustworthy, or take advantage of the existing legitimacy or illegitimacy of sources to try to control what people believe. So I think that's kind of interesting too.
Yeah. Do any of the students want to follow up or start a new question?
Yeah,
I have, yeah, you can go, Dev.
I was going to say, just I've read the draft paper that you put out on the epistemic factionalization, or the grouping of beliefs with those you trust. Do you think they are all genuine beliefs though, or there is cases of expressive responding in the sense that they're just sort of signaling a political allegiance in a way that's not actually a genuine belief that they are going to act on?
Yeah, that paper's published now, by the way. It took a while. It's done. Yeah, I think this is like super important and a really good point. So we sort of model this process whereby, like, you're really just thinking about beliefs and trusting people who hold different beliefs. But I think another really important thing regarding these belief factions is exactly what you said, that certain beliefs become not just statements about your belief, but statements about group membership, that it signals to others. If I say, like, I mean, this is in the US, but if I say, like, I'm a gun owner and I think everyone should be able to own as many guns as they want, that tells people not just about my gun ownership information, but all sorts of other things about me. It tells them I'm almost certainly a Republican. It tells them like things about whether I go to church. It tells them, you know, likely things about my attitudes on 20 other issues. And it's a kind of like signal of in-group membership. So this is something we haven't modeled, but I think is certainly going on and is really important, and definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, part of me thinks when there is that sort of expressive responding, that it's a harmless sort of belief, in a sense that it isn't action guiding in the way that the first order belief that they're talking about, or that common belief that brings about the trust, can have real world consequences, I guess. But then another part of me thinks that the way that it can lead to that polarization is going to have very significant real world consequences.
Yeah. For a lot of these, I think it's really hard to know what is the kind of belief state of the people expressing and avowing certain positions. So, for example, and I'm sorry that all my examples are so US centered. I'm just being a totally self-centered American, as like we all are. But you know, there was this study after Donald Trump was inaugurated that showed these pictures of his inauguration crowd and Obama's inauguration crowd, which maybe you guys are familiar with. And well, I mean, we write about it in the book too. And all of these Republicans would say, like, there's more people in the Trump crowd, even though in the pictures you can just see there's fewer people. And it's clear there that they're, you know, if you said, I'm going to give you $1,000 to pick the right picture, I'm pretty sure they'd pick the one that had that larger number of people. You can just look, you can count them if you want, right? So what are they doing? Do they really believe this? Well, there could be a possibility that they're just expressing in-group membership, that it's some expressive thing. There could be a possibility that they're saying this to conform with others who they take to be in their in-groups, to like impress people who are the people they want to impress. But I also wonder if there are these like quasi belief states people enter when they say these kinds of things, where like maybe on some level they might know it's false, but they can also kind of entertain it or treat it as true. And one thing I kind of like in philosophy is this work, and now I can't remember who first started this, about like conversational grounds, where you introduce conversational grounds, and then once it's introduced, everyone in the conversation will treat it as true. So if I say like, well, of course, John is a liar, like you may or may not accept that belief, but once I've said it, if you don't counter it, it becomes part of the conversation we're all having, this premise, right? And so I think that sometimes these statements can act that way, where they become part of a premise where further argumentation is built upon them and further beliefs are built upon them. So they become part of chains of reason in a weird way. And I also think sometimes when people keep saying these things, they really do start to believe them, right? So like maybe with masking polarization, like at first a lot of people were like, well, I'm just going to say you shouldn't mask to support the president. But eventually, as they keep saying it, they have to not mask to not be hypocrites. And then maybe they develop some cognitive state where they're like, and this really is safe, you know, to kind of make sense of their behavior. And so, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, I think probably there are messy things happening between statements you make and the beliefs you actually hold.
Yeah, this reminds me of a paper that Jenna shared, and that we had a reading group around, that focused on self-deception and our impressive ability to self-deceive. But the focus was on from an evolutionary perspective. So it was showing how possibly could it have been advantageous, like what's the fitness advantage of being able to self-deceive. And there were various different views on it, like it seemed like quite a contested in the nascent stages of philosophy of psychology, and a lot of them were evolutionary biologists. Yeah, Jenna, what do you think?
Yeah, I did wonder, like, I know you framed your book as misinformation as being a social phenomenon. I mean, not withstanding the psychological aspects of it, but I couldn't help but can return to those psychological, the epistemic failures and cognitive biases, and the way our brains are predictive engines, and we're trying to minimize surprisal by continuously matching our internal model with what we're perceiving in the environment, and how one way to do that is to update your internal beliefs, but another way is to manipulate your environment to match your internal model. And when you've got the internet, and it's so easy to manipulate your online environment by which information or what information you're exposed to, but it's like almost easier to change your external environment these days than to change your beliefs to match the reality of what's going on. So can
I ask, why do we say this is psychological bias? And I mean, I understand, there's been, I suppose, a bias in the scientific community to individualism, which can eclipse some of these, really impactful effects of social engagement, social networks and things. But are these not, like, for example, in the first chapter, talking about polarization and conformity, there are some parts where you say, okay, sure, individual psychological biases exist, but let's look at all of these other features. Like describing the effects of social networks, are they not psychological biases? Because they can occur on a group level. I mean, nothing can be just about the individual, right? Like, it's psychosocial.
Well, so I think this is it's something I thought a lot about more since publishing the book, and I think is a really germane critique. So when we were publishing it, we were trying to respond to all this stuff that really was focusing on reasoning biases. Like, you get evidence, how do you reason about that evidence? And then we were writing about this as if our book isn't about psychological biases, it's about something else. But really all the kind of social interactional biases we're talking about are other it's based in other psychological facts about people. And so it's in fact quite grounded in and connected up with individual psychology, just not always the same features of individual psychology that people had been mostly focusing on at that point. But like conformity bias is of course a bias. And yeah. So there's that. And then there's also, since then, I've been thinking much more about the way that like reasoning biases and social facts about learning interact, which, you know, when you put them together, sometimes there can be emergent phenomena that might not be clear when you just think about one side of this coin or the other. And so I think that like a better picture of thinking of like the social spread of belief and social influence between people and these different processes has to also consider things like confirmation bias, for example. Yeah.
So to follow up on that a little bit, Cailin, you may have come across Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday.
I literally, look what's propping up my phone right now.
It's really good.
I had a quote debate with Hugo yesterday morning, literally yesterday morning, for the Pitt Center. So I just read that on Monday in preparation for the debate.
Okay, it's a small world.
Oh no, what's up? Sorry, one sec.
Take your time.
You okay?
No.
How are you going, Mark? How are your levels of fatigue?
I'm awake. I managed to sleep in until around noon, and then all of the neighbors started doing their home renovations again, which they've been doing since March. So things are going great.
Your strategy to stay awake and not go to bed.
I have a very large amount of coffee here.
Okay.
That is a very large amount.
Well, this is my first of 2 seminars tonight. So I've got another 3.5 hours to go.
Oh, wow.
So while Cailin is dealing with things, I thought it might be interesting to talk about this signaling topic. So one way to signal is to say that you have certain beliefs, like to say, you know, you think that hydroxychloroquine is an effective treatment, or that masks are not useful, or whatever. But another way to signal what you believe is to actually engage in behavior. So if you want to signal your group membership, you might just not wear a mask very conspicuously, or you might, you know, wear a certain kind of red hat, or you might, to not use an American example, you might violate the Melbourne curfew by participating in a QAnon protest. And it seems to me like, in a way, it doesn't actually matter what people believe, because if you're worried about things like expressive responding and expressive behavior, then that's going to come out in both the way that people talk and report their beliefs and in the way that they act. And if someone is willing to, say, endanger themselves and those near them in this expressive way, whether or not they believe that some relevant proposition is true, then that's what we should care about, rather than what the content of their beliefs is. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I guess the way I was sort of separating it earlier was, I don't think all examples of that sort of expressing one's beliefs are action guiding. As in, they could just be doing it they could be doing it online, or they could be doing it to signal that allegiance, or just to annoy people. But yeah, you can see, regardless of whether it is a genuine belief or not, that it could still promote action of others, if that makes sense. Like, it alters the norm of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So, like, for example, you mentioned the Melbourne lockdown one. So you might have somebody online just saying, I'm not going to wear mask, it's stupid wearing mask, Dan Andrews is an idiot, yada, yada, yada. That in and of itself might not promote action with that person, but I guess it still can promote action of others.
Yeah, or even that person might show up at an anti-mask protest not wearing a mask and shouting in people's faces. Even if they believe that that's unsafe, they might, in order to sort of engage in something like costly signaling, they might go and do that thing that they know is in on some level is unsafe for them and for others.
Yeah, so the beliefs that are obviously action guiding and action producing are the ones that we're concerned about.
Right. So does this take us to the general phenomenon identified in the book that, well, maybe not a phenomenon, but a principle that beliefs matter insofar as they ground action, and polarization can be so strong, especially political polarization, that the facts even fade into the background.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this conversation is interesting in like pulling out so beliefs are important in grounding actions, but then there's all these other features too that determine what actions you actually take beyond your kind of propositional type beliefs about the world, or your degrees of belief in different propositions. I guess like the main thing that we talk about in the book that is related to that is conformity, and the idea that like you'll take actions to conform that don't like fit the beliefs you might hold otherwise.
Okay. Yep.
Like the Solomon Ash examples you mentioned.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, so to return to our friend Hugo, so he argues, this is maybe not quite fair to him, but he basically says that conformity bias is not a bias, right? He thinks that if you have a group of people who have enough independent access to information, then trusting the consensus in that group, or the majority in that group, is the reasonable thing to do. And there's something to that, right? Like if all your friends are jumping off a bridge, it might actually be the right thing to do to jump off the bridge because your friends are kind of reasonable. Yeah.
The XKCD cartoon he uses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Especially when you're in a situation where you have to make a decision quickly, or like you don't have all the information, so But so how is trust different to conformity, Mark?
Well, would it be all right if first we address this issue, the Mercier argument? So yeah, I think that this idea that shows there isn't conformity bias is to kind of conflate the explanation for why we have conformity bias with it not existing. So a lot of people think the reason we show a conformist bias is to do just this, to kind of quickly and easily pull together information that other individuals know and let it guide our actions in a relatively cognitively simple way, right? So on the assumption that other people tend to have information we might not, to conform to them is to use that information in our best interest. But that doesn't show there's no conformity bias. So for example, in the Ash experiments, people are very much aware that they're not making the right statement, right? And if you ask them later, they'll say like, well, yeah, I could kind of see that it wasn't that one, but I just didn't want to say it. And there have been a bajillion follow-ups on the Ash experiment. It's an incredibly replicable, robust finding. And you can do things like give them more money and then they pick the right thing if you give them enough money. But then if you make the problem harder and give them more money, they tend to depend on others more. So you can pull apart there a conformity bias that's not based in rationality and actual rational behavior where you're making an estimate like, well, I think other people probably know more than me about this domain, right? So you can see that like when you make the problem hard, people start to think, well, I might be wrong here. So even though it's high stakes, I probably should conform in case I mess up. When you make the problem easy, people conform anyway. And so the bias is there, even if it might be there for what's usually a good reason.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the evolutionary advantages of hypersociality is that you're reducing the cognitive load. Like you don't have to learn everything from scratch if you just copy. So it makes sense that it's kind of like wired into our framework.
So, can I jump in? So is the special, remarkable thing going on here that makes it a bias is that, under experimental conditions, by making the task simple, they suddenly still have the tendency to conform anyway. Is that where it becomes problematic?
Yeah, I think the thing that is just seems to me like a very clear bias is that in cases where people know that X is not true, they'll still say X. Yeah. Okay. In order to conform with others.
And that's the powerful phenomenon that the Ash experiment.
Yeah.
Never
yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, it also, for me at least, coheres very much with kind of common sense observations of everyday behavior. I mean, I do that all the time. Maybe I'm just a high conformity person, but like if I'm talking face to face with someone I don't know that well and they say something that's anti-evolution, I'm like, oh yeah, thank you, Jesus, for your help. But like, I'm not gonna jump in there and be like, hey, you're wrong, because it's psychologically uncomfortable. I don't want to do that. It just would be really uncomfortable to do. And so I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm similar. Like I would privilege like social harmony than, being right or making sure the truth wins out or something.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do.
Hi, by the way. Is this all working? Sorry.
Hi, Jamie. Yeah, it's working.
Cool. I was just interested. So you did note in that experiment that like some people did make the correct answer despite the bias. Is there any knowledge about like what might cause people to make the correct answer and go against conformity bias? Like what? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, and in fact, most people, I mean, when they run this experiment cross-culturally, they find systematic cultural differences in how many people will conform and how many people will go with their own statement, but always at least some people conform. So the majority of people, in fact, say what they can see is true in most versions of the experiment, because they want to say the thing that's true, presumably. What I think is interesting is like, reading, well, I mean, I think that just explains it. Like they don't want to, in fact, make a false statement. They want to like make a true statement. But I think we note in the book, like if you look at the transcripts, you still see those people expressing a desire to conform and a discomfort not conforming a lot of the time.
I suppose like what it would be interesting is like tracing that is if like you're able to identify like what traits is it like more highly educated, less highly educated, like coming from certain socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. Like would that then translate to people who are less likely to believe fake news or more likely to like think really critically about it, etc., etc. Like would there be a way of like taking that into finding ways to potentially combat or like protect yourself against forms of fake news in that sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. So many people have done this experiment. I'm sure there have been ones that focused on different personal aspects.
Yeah, so one that was done a few years ago with a decent sample size used the Big Five personality inventory to try to predict this kind of thing. I don't know if people are familiar with Big Five, so it's like a 5-dimensional model of personality where each dimension represents on a sort of sliding scale certain aspects of people's dispositions. And the acronym for it is OCEAN. So that stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or emotional instability. And what they found in this study, at least, was that the people who scored high on agreeableness were the most inclined to go along with the majority, even when they knew it was wrong. And agreeableness is measured in this kind of inventory in terms of basically like not wanting to stir things up, not wanting to cause trouble. So it's not like being a kind person or a sympathetic person. It's just like aversion to trouble. So it's the people who are unwilling to create a problem or to cause a stink that seem to be the main problem with this kind of thing.
That's interesting. I mean, also there have been now, oh, sorry, were you? Well, yeah, now there have been like a number of studies about sharing of fake news and misinformation and like who shares it. And some of these have shown things like, there seems to be a dependable age effect where the older you are, the more likely you are to share it. There's a pretty dependable, like along the political spectrum effect where far right tends to be associated with sharing more fake news. But there was also a paper recently in philosophy, and Mark knows about this, like looking experimentally at intellectual vices. This was by Marco Meyer, and like how that associated with like belief in conspiracy theories and sharing false information. And he found these associations between different intellectual vices and the likelihood to share that stuff and believe conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I know about that because I'm a co-author.
Oh, you're a co-author? Oh, but on the follow-up paper, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
so
was like, I know Mark's connected to this, but yeah.
Yeah. So we found that people who score high on epistemic vice are much more likely to accept and also to share conspiracy theories, and that's been replicated now with this many lab studies that Jay Van Battle organized with 50,000 participants in 67 countries. So I think it's a pretty robust finding at this point that people who are willing to tell you in a questionnaire that like they're not willing to be corrected even when it's pretty obvious that they're wrong, those are the people who accept and share conspiracy theories.
Can I ask, has that been published yet, this, the big
No,
paper?
but it's under review right now, but you can get the data at the Open Science Framework website associated with it anytime you want. I can share that link if people would be interested.
Yeah. So this didn't make it into the book, did it, Cailin? I don't remember reading something about epistemic vices, or maybe you used a different term.
Well, this is newer work than, so we finished writing the book in 2017, but this has just come out. So, I mean, the one Mark's talking about is right still under review, and the one that Marco had published, which I read, was just published, I don't know, this
super
year.
fresh.
Yeah.
Game changing.
Just to clarify, when you're like in these studies, for example, what are you using as a measure of epistemic vices, or what do you consider epistemic vices? Because like, for example, some things could be epistemic virtues in some situations and vices in another situation, or to different degrees.
Yeah, so there's two scales that we use. One is one I developed and published a few years ago, and one is one that Marco developed just this year. The one that I developed is just 6 items, and you ask people to agree or disagree with them. And they include things like only wimps admit that they've made mistakes. I don't mind learning from people even if they have lower status than me, things like that.
Okay, good.
So it's not, what's weird about it is that psychologists would not develop a scale like this because it's so clearly value laden. And in general with psychological scales, they try to keep them value neutral. But we sort of figured like, if there are people who are willing to tell you that they aren't going to change their minds even when it's obvious that they're wrong, it's good to know that it's good to know about that. And so probably the scale is not like a perfect measure of exactly what people's mental states are. There's some sort of signaling involved, but people who are willing to signal that they're basically assholes, if they're willing to tell us that, they're probably going to act and behave and believe in certain ways outside of our study as well.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about, in the sense that like you might say closed-mindedness is a vice, but how would you actually get somebody to work out whether they're closed-minded in a study? But the example about not changing beliefs is a pretty clear one.
Apparently they'll just say it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, so probably there are people who are moderately closed-minded who don't tell us. But the people who are really proud of being closed-minded are like, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, so the nature of the experiment brings out those extreme cases.
Yeah, and it's not a normal distribution. So on this scale, the vast majority of people appear to be open-minded. There's only like 15% of people who appear to be closed-minded, but they're the ones who are responsible for all the trouble.
So this is a cumulative thing where you add up the scores and give them, or you pick, like you specify in one bias in particular that is responsible for the sharing of fake news.
Sorry, I didn't
Like,
quite hear. Say it again?
Is it like you allocate a score where you would ask all these questions and then they get like an overall rating of how of their epistemic biases, or do you pick one particular epistemic bias that seems prevalent in the sharing of fake news?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that these sorts of studies work is that you have a bunch of items that you ask people to agree or disagree with, and then you do what's called a factor analysis, which examines the intercorrelations among their answers, and then you essentially just slap a label on the factor. So you could call it closed-mindedness, you could call it epistemic vice, you could call it whatever you want, but it's whatever it is that people who tend to agree and disagree with these items have, that's the thing that you're measuring. And so you try to write the items in such a way that they measure the thing that you've slapped a label on, but of course it's always a bit of a imperfect art.
Because I wondered, like going back to the self-deception issue that Kitty raised, I wondered when reading the book that, like the issue, I think, with a lot of the sharing of fake news and conspiracy theories in today's society is that these people believe that they are actually smarter than the experts, and that they know something that the rest of us sheeple can't see. So they have this skewed perception of their own intelligence, that it doesn't matter what facts to the contrary you provide them, they know better. So there's no reasoning.
I mean, it's the thing where like the less you know about something, the more likely you are to be kind of confident in your opinion on it. Kind of.
Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly.
So Jenna, Neil. Oh, Jenna's disappeared. I was going to say, Neil Levy in that paper, the radically socialized knowledge and conspiracy theories, goes into that, and how we sort of, we don't recognize how our knowledge is so social, and we give ourselves more credit for the creation of our knowledge and our beliefs.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I had another question just about the book in general, or just sort of separate from what we've been chatting about so far. I guess in the book you highlight how like science isn't sort of fixed, and generally scientists will reach a consensus, but sometimes it doesn't happen. And I guess by its nature, science isn't certain, like it's falsifiable and changes over time as new evidence and yada, yada, yada. So that's obviously what conspiracy theorists and those that hold on to false beliefs seem to thrive on. So like uncertainty or science being wrong or whatever it might be. The thing that spurred this question is in that Neil Levy paper as well. He talks about like relevant epistemic authorities who you should refer to get your information from. But that still leaves the question of who the actual authority is. So related to that in the book, with all these things that a conspiracy theorist or someone with false belief might be holding on to, how do you identify what the actual relevant authority is on the matter, or more so, how do you convince someone who the authority is that you should be listening to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that like I have any, like saving full-on conspiracy theorists who are real science skeptics and are convinced that like the man is trying to, you know, spread a bunch of false beliefs and microchip us and all this stuff. Like, I don't know that there's a lot to do for those people. But I think like what you're talking about is related to the like 2 expert, 1 novice problem that Alvin Goldman talks about in his book and has talked about in social epistemology. Like in general, how do novices find good experts when they, by definition, don't have the domain knowledge to tell the difference between experts? There's like something I'll just mention because one of my students has been reading about it and writing about it recently, and I think it's kind of interesting, though it's only kind of tangentially related to this. He's writing about this like computer science work called prediction with expert advice, where basically what you do is you have a scenario where you're a predictor and you're taking a bunch of different possible experts who are making predictions of different sorts, and then you can kind of follow different algorithms to start weighting those different experts on the basis of successes. And there are different proofs showing that like some of these algorithms will necessarily lead you to the best possible predictions you could make under these scenarios. And I think this is kind of interesting as a kind of solution to the 2 expert, 1 novice problem. It doesn't work in every scenario, but in scenarios where experts make repeated predictions about things like sports predictions or election predictions or weather predictions, it actually should work pretty well. And it's basically an inductive framework where you see have they been right in the past, and you just keep checking on that. And then you take that as a good guide to the future.
Yeah, so relevant to that, I think, is, again, Mercier's book, and also the Benkler book that I mentioned. So, is someone joining?
No, so that was my email, I think.
Oh, okay, no worries. So one of the things that's interesting comparing the Benkler book, I just shared a link to it, and the Mercier book, is that Mercier seems to be quite optimistic and the Benkler book is extremely pessimistic. But one of the things that they agree about is the problem of so-called hidden dependencies. So if David and Kitty and Jenna and Jamie all tell me the same thing, then I might think, oh wow, that probably is true because all these different people who haven't chatted with each other in advance have the same opinion. But if you all like had a secret Zoom meeting and said like, we're gonna tell Mark that P is true, and then you all tell me that, that doesn't actually add any information, right? It just is gonna be deceiving. So what Mercier talks about in the book, in Not Born Yesterday, is this problem of so-called hidden dependencies, where your sources seem to be independent of each other, and so you add more weight to the fact that you've got multiple sources telling you the same thing, even though they're actually dependent on each other. And in the Benkler book, one of the things that they show is that in certain political media, there are just absolutely massive hidden dependencies where, for instance, Tucker Carlson, who's a host on Fox News, is also a founder of the Daily Caller. And so the Daily Caller will publish a story, and then Tucker Carlson will report on it that night. And you're like, oh, I heard this from 2 independent sources, it must be true. But actually, it's just the same person saying the same thing to you twice. So that kind of thing, I think, is relevant here, where we think that we're getting sort of new information, but sometimes it's actually just non-independent or information that's sort of disguised, or if not disguised, then we just don't notice that there are dependencies involved.
This becomes more of an issue with social media as well now, right? Like when you have algorithms that are literally just like, because you only have a finite amount of things that you can like see and digest, and when you're getting, you know, targeted things to you that are literally pointing you towards one direction or another, seems to become even more of an issue.
Well, so this is something that my group has been thinking a lot about and building a model of, because, you know, it should be even worse on social media, because if you think about network connections, the friends of your friends are often your friends, which means if there's information sharing between them, there are likely to be hidden dependencies, and you're likely to keep seeing multiple information. I've seen at least one empirical study of people's like belief updating on social media that shows that they like empirically update too much when they see the same information again and again from multiple people, compared to how much they ought to think, well, this is just the same information shared among them. And there's like even names for biases along these lines, like repetition bias, where people keep becoming more confident in something the more it's repeated, which makes sense if it's independent information, doesn't make sense if it's dependent information. But people, even when they see the same news article shared multiple times, will sometimes become more convinced of it. It's the same news article. It's just that more people have shared it. So I think this is like really important to think about on social media because of these network and sharing structures.
I mean, it takes me back to my first year of a degree, and I think it's critical thinking, and it was talking about the bubble, your social media bubble, effectively, and how you take all your things from a certain group, and like the more you like take them in, the more you're going to find more things which agree with that, effectively confirmation bias, and soon you're just going to have a certain bubble of one idea, and you're not going to step outside it. And it's effectively enhancing polarization in that sense, I guess. Like, yeah. I don't know if people remember that. I remember it very distinctly. Yeah.
That's like a perfect example of how you can, like, the online environment is so malleable that you can so easily change your environment rather than your internal model. So you can believe something and you just continue to search out that information, and eventually the echo chamber just reinforces that for you. Yeah. But on another, just what you were saying before, Cailin, I come from a very brief stint in public relations, and like you would write up a media release for a client, and then you would distribute that media release, and most publications, whether online or in print, would just publish it verbatim. So you get like a whole lot of repeated instances of this one data set. And it just and that might seem, oh wow, this is a big story. It's being like, you know, I'm seeing it everywhere, but it's actually just one article that was shot out to a whole lot of people who have published the exact same thing. And so it's not really like a whole minute research.
Yeah, this like spring and summer, I've been part of basically a propaganda effort of a similar sort, where I was part of like a white paper working group thinking about the US election and possible crises. And I was like the misinformation group. And like one of the recommendations that came out of the group was trying to really push this line in the US, like that it's not election day, it's election week, that on election night, it'll be too close to tell, that like it takes a long time to get democracy right. And the group started pushing this message and ended up getting it in a bunch of different news sources. But then also, like, the leader of the group, every time one of these news sources came out, would tell all of us to tweet it out. And so we'd all tweet the same information and try to, like, you know, tag other people. And it's been at least somewhat successful. Like, my in-laws had heard this line about election week a couple months ago. But we exactly just used attempts at repetition bias, even though there's one source here. Eventually there became more sources, right, as people started using this term again and again. But, like, yeah, we tried to spread an idea using this exact thing.
You actually, like, I see all this stuff on Twitter all the time as well, where you see the same, like, even just with like an academic paper being shared or something, and then you see multiple people sharing it. There's a program in Australia called Media Watch that comes out every week, and it looks at what the media has sort of jumped on, and it might be a false article that someone's planted that's just got out of control and reported on every primetime news station since. And then obviously the question arises of whether the damage has been done, even though that information is clearly false.
Yeah, I love Media Watch. Oh, you go, Siavash, because I've spoken a lot, but yeah.
I have a different question about the book. So if anyone has stuff that they want to talk about that's related to this, probably just go before me.
Yeah, and then maybe we can close this and move on. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay, so we were talking about, what was the phrase again? Oh, hidden dependencies. So you have these sources of information that seem to be independent of one another, and that can lend itself to the spread of misinformation, because it's more compelling when they seem to be coming from different sources. And I'm thinking about, you know, on a large scale of democracies and this feeling, this anti-establishment sentiment that's, you know, been so powerful lately, you know, with the 2006 election and continuing. And I think this feeling of you know, being against the man that is in control, and that there's this global government agenda to keep people servile, and, you know, that basically, you know, those in power are opposed to democracy. Like, I think there is something in that, and I don't think that I don't think that it's completely a conspiracy theory. And so looking at these interconnecting kind of clues that people get, maybe the common consensus is that you know, points to a more generalized conclusion that, you know, there's a conspiracy, and that, I don't know, lizards dominate us or something like this. But sometimes there is an agenda of anti-democracy, right? For example, like there are power plays going on that might on the surface lend itself to a conspiracy theory, but deep down it is a more difficult explanation, but deep down you can make the connections between you know, the power of global elites and corporations. For example, like with Julian Assange, maybe you might think that, oh look at these you know, various sources condemning him, and that he is not credible as a journalist, and that he is, you know, that the character assassination campaign is, you know, genuine and just about fact. But if you do look at the hidden, I think there is a hidden dependency in that there is an agenda, you know, going on. And I think that's become clearer as, you know, the extradition move did play out in the end. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like you're not paranoid if they're really out to get you or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is like looking at cases of industrial propaganda. I mean, a lot of them look like bonkers conspiracy theories, except they're real things that happened. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a book by Naomi Oreskes.
Oh yeah, and Merchants of Doubt. Yeah.
Merchants of Doubt. Yeah, if you're interested in this kind of thing, she's a sociologist, I think, at Harvard, and she just documents the actual conspiracies by primarily the fossil fuel industry and the tobacco industry over the course of several decades. I think one thing that's worth thinking about here is the different uses of this phrase conspiracy theory. So one way of using it is sort of purely descriptive. It's just a conspiracy theory is a theory according to which there is a conspiracy. And there are conspiracies, they happen. So some conspiracy theories are true. But there's also like a mindset that you can get into where you look for conspiracies everywhere, or in lots of places where you shouldn't. And that's the dangerous thing. That's the thing where you end up like believing in QAnon or whatever. And it's important to recognize that there are actually genuine conspiracies, like, you know, Iran-Contra was a conspiracy. Famously, about a decade ago, somebody in philosophy published a paper about conspiracy theories saying like, here are 5 crazy conspiracy theories. And one of them was the United States government is monitoring all inter-Atlantic communications. It was just true, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And people can pose them as so like extremist and ridiculous, or, you know, that, oh, sorry, someone's calling me. I'm just gonna cancel that. That, you know, international peacekeeping or, you know, foreign intervention in other countries is, you know, just a ploy to, you know, maintain, you know, the global politics as it stands, and to maintain, you know, the global order or something like that. And if you say, if in such simple terms, yeah, it does sound a bit oversimplistic and silly, but if you actually, you know, get into descriptive detail about how it functions and about, you know, the actual factual grounds of foreign interventions, you see that, you know, this idea of, you know, just maintaining the peace or whatever is a conspiracy. Well, is that too far, do you think? Do you think that's one of the cases where, you know, you can read agency into something when there is none?
I was just going to say, I think this is connected to like something interesting. I keep thinking and looking at these historical cases in science where people either turned out to be right or turned out to be wrong, because in a lot of times these cases are used to kind of like illustrate failures of science, but often it'll be that like people are acting in the same way across different cases, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong, and there wasn't really a way to know at the time what the right thing was going to be. So they reject some outsider scientists, and in retrospect, it looks like they were being way too conservative and doubtful of this person. But in fact, most of the time we reject outsider scientists because usually they're wrong. And so, you know, in thinking about like the epistemic success of actions, it's always a little tricky because case to case, you can be taking the right action or the wrong action, and it can depend on details of the case. Whereas like, there might be some actions that across many cases will be better. Still, sometimes it won't be the right thing to do, like to be too skeptical or whatever. Yeah, so that, I think what you're talking about like connects up to that.
Yeah, so can I follow up on that a little bit? So would you associate that with like the Duhem-Quine problem and the sort of stuff that Lakatos talks about in terms of there being no sort of, what does he say, no instant rationality? So the idea that like at a certain point, it might seem like this is a crazy conspiracy theory, but if we follow up on it long enough, we might actually find out that, yeah, actually they are wiretapping everything that goes between the US and the UK. Is that essentially the same kind, like structurally the same problem?
I mean, it's probably a related problem. I mean, it's all stuff to do with legitimate uncertainty when you're in the middle of a scientific process or an inquiry process. And I guess like part of what I'm responding to is that like with 2020 hindsight, it's very easy to judge people who got it wrong in the end. But when you're actually in the middle of that kind of process, you know, because of the flexibility of webs of belief and things like this, and the way we all use our current theories to guide our like thoughts about new theories, it can just be extraordinarily difficult to figure out what's right or wrong at a particular point.
There's in some of the literature on conspiracy theories, like I think Brian Cailin talks about unwarranted conspiracy theories versus warranted, and basically like the problem is dismissing a conspiracy theory outright just because it's a conspiracy theory, whereas it should only be dismissed in light of actually reviewing the available evidence. Look, you see there's a lot of philosophers that are quite sympathetic to conspiracy theories. I know, Mark, you did a Philosopher's Zone a few years ago podcast in Australia where David Cody was on it as well, and he's got a book called What to Believe Now. He's sort of quite sympathetic to the fact that some conspiracy theories do become true. So for that reason, you've got to consider them. Yeah. But the problem arises where you, in light of evidence that suggests otherwise, you hold on to that conspiracy theory or hold on to that theory.
Sometimes because it's a conspiracy, the evidence like on the surface will suggest otherwise, you know.
You can only base your beliefs on the evidence you have available.
Yeah, but sometimes the evidence will come from like places you might not expect, you know, like for example, going back to the Dylan Assange case. I know this may be a bit too polarizing, but it's the one that keeps popping into mind. This idea that it was a conspiracy theory that, you know, that the Swedish prosecution or Interpol were trying to pursue him on this allegations of sexual misconduct as part of a broader plan to get him for spying and to shut down WikiLeaks and whistleblowers, blah, blah, blah. That turned out to be, I mean, I think had some basis in truth that there was an agenda to extradite him, you know, as we saw. But, you know, the evidence that I think you would look for that the evidence that ended up being relevant, given the hindsight that we know that there was a, you know, intergovernmental agenda to crack down on whistleblowers, wouldn't have been what's immediately available. You know, I think you have to look at, you know, like Obama's policies toward whistleblowers and the increasing like resentment and harshness and of increasing surveillance and increasing like militarization and all of these interconnected things, you know. But that only seems like evidence afterward, given that the conspiracy ended up being true.
Yeah, so like, I mean, I agree that you can't just dismiss it outright. It's something that's going to evolve and change over time as the evidence comes out. Like, so to just immediately say that's a conspiracy and throw it in the bin as a conspiracy theory would obviously be the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, so this is something that we lost Cailin, I guess. This is something
Sorry,
that...
I'm trying to swipe across the screens and accidentally swipe.
No worries. Feel free to leave whenever you need to. I realize we're taking a lot of your time. This is something that Colin Klein and I have been thinking about and working on. So there's sort of like two levels of conspiracy theories. So one is a theory according to which there's a conspiracy. And then the sort of higher order one is one according to which there's a conspiracy, and in that conspiracy, there have been systematic efforts to falsify evidence or obscure evidence. And that second one is really dangerous. And it's also the fact that sometimes conspirators do try to falsify evidence, but when the conspiracy involves that allegation, it's really problematic because essentially the theory becomes unfalsifiable. If you get evidence that's consistent with it, you say, see, I was right. And if you get evidence that's inconsistent with it, you say, see, they're covering it up.
Yeah, that's really tricky.
So which is not to say that that never happens, right? Because sometimes if you're actually engaged in a conspiracy, you might want to cover it up. That just happens sometimes. But epistemically, it's really problematic. And in this paper that I just shared in the chat, we show that the YouTube algorithm systematically promotes videos that relate to the second type of conspiracy theory, the one that says not only is there a conspiracy, but people are covering up the evidence of how they are conspiring. And that relates back to this issue of meta-trust again, because once you trust someone to tell you that there's a conspiracy, you probably also trust them to tell you that the evidence about it is being systematically distorted. And then there's almost nothing that can be done to get you out of that.
Yeah, I think this is why conspiracy campaigns, maybe it's too much to call it conspiracy campaigns, like the character assassination of whistleblowers, for example, has been so powerful. Like it's, I just find it one of the most amazing cases that, you know, that these journalists or whatever, like we've almost forgotten about it, you know. There's the smearing campaign, and then it's really popular in the news for a while, and public opinion is so like vehemently opposed to these people, and there's headlines like, oh, this person is a anti-American high-tech terrorist and just like an attention seeker and blah, blah, blah. And but all of this is really important, like factual information of what's been revealed about the conspirations of the US, like I think eclipsed, and then we don't really talk about it anymore.
I would just say that if we're talking about Assange, I do think he like failed to exercise a duty of care in the way that WikiLeaks goes about just all that data. I don't know if I'd classify him as a whistleblower so much as like an Edward Snowden type, but yeah.
Something I found
for
funny.
example, Chelsea Manning. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say at the start, Cailin, you were apologising for your American examples, whereas you can see most of our Australian examples are actually drawing on American politics and American examples. Yeah.
But they're all interrelated, right? Because the Five Eyes thing is what, the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and another Canada. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's not like these things are independent of each other.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, you go.
No. I was going to say I have another new topic I want to start.
And don't forget, Siavash had something.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Siavash, you've been sitting there patiently.
So my question is it's like at the end of the book, it's on like page 181. You wrote, it's too costly to allow industry to interfere with science, and it's too easy for it to do so, even when scientists are individually trustworthy, which I totally agree with. My question is that, so now because of COVID and stuff, we're seeing universities are they're cutting researchers, they're cutting academics, like they're kind of just shrinking everything, like all, not only are courses basically going to shrink into like, they're going to take 2 courses and make them into 1, for example, and they're just losing out on scientists and academics in general. It seems like this is actually a problem that's going to get worse, where industry is going to be like, oh, since you guys are all out of work, we've got work for you. Do you see that as like a problem now that this is kind of happening now with COVID and everything that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a different problem in kind, but maybe different in degree, that like we all want that dirty industry money to do more research. And it's hard to get money to do research. And of course, people want to take it. And there are really good reasons to take it, because research is often socially beneficial. So like, I guess the solutions that I would tend towards are like more socialism, but also potentially solutions where if industry wants research done, it has to fund it through some sort of governmental body, put the money through some governmental body that then gets to choose what is the lab that actually does the research and how does it actually get done. So if they want to fund scientists to look at whatever, a heart medication, they can't pick who the scientist is, and they can't, you know, specify anything to that scientist about how they do it. Instead, the money has to go to another source and then to the scientist. Something like that would maybe help. Goodness knows that's a system that's also corruptible in different ways.
Yeah, it's a really problematic situation because in many cases, the corporations operate not by picking labs, but by just setting the agenda. So, you know, we have research on topic X, but not topic Y because there's funding for it. So even if they're not saying like, yeah, there's going to be research on topic X by lab L, they still make it the case that there's research on this topic rather than another. And I mean, we see this in philosophy as well, like with Templeton Foundation funding. I'm personally involved with some of that, implicated, if you will. But it's not clear to me that funneling it through government fixes the problem, because at least from what I've seen here in the Netherlands, where everything is a public-private partnership, you just get like this messy thing where everything is somewhat corrupt and nobody can complain because everyone's a little bit dirty.
Yeah.
I guess I think like, so there's different problems. So one is this agenda setting problem. And I don't think that funneling private money through the government fixes that, because if private corporations are saying this is the research we need done, then they're giving money for that, then they're going to get to set the agenda no matter how that money is allocated, right? So I don't think that problem is solved. I think that other problems are solved regarding, first of all, like basically subconscious influence on researchers of knowing who's funding them and how they're going to get more money, right? So I think that research on how often industry funded research turns out the right way for industry indicates that that probably happens. Like, they're good scientists, but somehow their studies are often turning out the way they ought to. So I think that it helps with that problem. I also think it helps with this industrial selection problem that Bennett Coleman and Justin Bruner write about, where if industry can pick who gets the money, they can pick various characteristics of the scientific lab and team getting the money, and they can pick the scientists who are most likely to generate the outcomes they want.
Yeah.
Right.
There's the example in your book, Cailin, that was so shocking and that I was so like indignant about. That was, oh gosh, a scientist was handpicked by this board. It was about CFCs or ozone depletion. Maybe it was in the introduction. Anyway, like there was a complete like flagrant disregard of like the selection of experts, because one person was chosen that wasn't like sorry,
he wasn't an acid rain expert. He had no.
Yeah,
he was just a shill. Yeah, but I think like that. So like, I have a student right now who's thinking a lot about advisory boards and the selection of people for advisory boards. And that's one thing. And another thing is this idea that like, just by giving money to certain people, you create more research in the style that they do it. Yeah. And if you can check who's doing that, then you have this enormous power over the findings of the community.
Yeah, one thing
we also have a problem of selective sharing as well, right? So if you have like industry that's funding the research, they would kind of have access, they would be able to choose what kind of gets published and what doesn't, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of places there are controls meant to stop that, but if it's in-house research, then certainly that seems to happen a lot.
Yeah, so here at Delft, for instance, about 2/3 of the research is funded by Shell and Philips and other big Dutch corporations. And In many cases, the PIs don't arrange in advance to be able to publish their findings regardless of how things turn out. So what that ends up meaning is that if the findings are sort of okay with or supportive of things that Shell wants, then it's okay to send them to Science or Nature or whatever journal you're interested in. But if the results are not things that are flattering for Shell, then they can just say, well, you can't publish that, it's a trade secret.
That is not just a little bad, that is just astoundingly horrible practice, actually.
Yeah, it's really bad. I've been teaching for 5 years.
Before you were like, it's a little corrupt.
teaching this PhD course on scientific integrity, and just hearing the students telling me about like what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do is absolutely astonishing.
And are these in the sciences, Mark?
Yeah, so it's an engineering university. So, these are people doing...
So stuff that bears on climate change.
Yeah, I was going to say, so climate change is a hoax at that university?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's funny.
So folks, I think I do have to head out and wrangle these children now. It was really nice talking with y'all. And
really appreciate it,
Cailin.
Yeah, thanks, Cailin.
Yeah, thank you.
Love
for
your
joining.
book.
Very much, Cailin.
We can share the video with you if you want later.
Okay, sure.
Thanks.
See ya.
Thank you, Cailin.
Thank you.
Well, that was really cool. I'm glad that she was able to join us. Now you're
Thanks
just
for
stuck
arranging that, Mark.
now you're just stuck with me.
Can I ask a question?
So go ahead.
I wondered whether looking at the issue of misinformation and conspiracy theory through an existentialist lens would be informative, in the sense of, like, in an era where perhaps people are less inclined to be devoutly religious. I mean, I know that still exists, but there's a decreasing percentage of the population. If we turn to conspiracy theory to regain a sense of meaning and control over our existence?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so you might think, for instance, that the QAnon conspiracy theory, you've probably encountered this in Australia as well. It's here in the Netherlands too. It's everywhere at this point.
Huge in Australia.
You might think that is sort of quasi-religious. I think that there's something about religious beliefs that makes them fit this profile, namely that in general, adopting a religious belief only signals your identity or your group membership and has very little bearing on your actual behavior. So, for instance, if you believe in transubstantiation versus consubstantiation, like the Eucharist becomes the body of Christ, or that it merely symbolizes the body of Christ, doesn't make much difference in your everyday life. But if you adopt one of these beliefs versus the other, that tells you and others around you whether you're Catholic or Protestant. In the same way, you might think that adopting various conspiracy theories doesn't have much of an effect on like how you make dinner, whether you drive on the right or the left side of the road, but it does tell you and other people which groups you belong to and are excluded from. And so it's a way of signaling group membership via either actually adopting a belief or at least pretending or to adopt a belief. And I think that there's something to that, yeah.
Would you go further and say that in sort of like the lizard people example, which I know in Australia, the government banned David Icke from entering when he was meant to come, I think it was last year, But if you come across this conspiracy and you think, oh, that's why I can't get ahead in life, because these lizard people are keeping me down, and like my world makes sense now. Like I get it. Like it's not God who has a plan for me. It's the powers at the top who have a plan to control me or oppress me. Like I wonder if you could go as far as saying that it gives your life meaning, and it helps you make sense of what is otherwise a random universe, in the same way that believing in a higher power may do. Oh, get away. Sorry.
Yeah, so there's also a pretty well-established set of findings that people who are sort of doing poorly tend to adopt conspiracy theories. So that may relate to what you're saying, in the sense that if things are going badly for you, you might sort of look around and be like, okay, why is my life terrible? It must be that there's some group of people who's trying to keep me down, or hurt me, or oppose me in some way. And that might not be unreasonable, right? Sometimes that happens. But it might be that we too easily turn to that kind of explanation, even though what's really going on is like global capitalism has fucked you.
I was going to take note of capitalism.
Yeah, and I think there are so many like countervailing forces behind that are pushing and pulling maybe against this, like how you're going to attribute you're doing well or not in life, like, there is the bias, the psychological bias of what is it called, misattribution or externalization or something like that. Like when something goes wrong for us, we're more likely to point to something outside of ourselves, rather than like our own some fault of our own. But and maybe this the ideology of the self-made person and the neoliberal agenda for taking responsibility for yourself and for your own life, and which kind of puts the risk onto individuals rather than like collectivization, like healthcare, for example, like you could say, I think there's an idea that like everyone ought to be responsible for themselves, and things going wrong in your life, or you can't get a job, or you have no sense of career, is your own failing, but that turns our attention away from the systemic failings of a society and being able to provide meaningful, good jobs. I didn't need to take so long to say that.
Yeah, I feel like this is happening. Like Trump getting COVID is a pretty good example of it, where he comes out and he's like, "Don't be afraid of it." It's like, well, yeah, you have like a team of like the best doctors in the world giving you like treatment that is literally not available to anyone else. Yeah, I expect you to be feeling pretty good. Whereas like everyone else that can't even afford healthcare, like, so it's like, yeah, you don't let it take over your life.
Is he saying that?
Yeah, like
it's not that bad.
No, he literally made a video saying like, don't let it take over your life. Don't be afraid of it. I feel better than I did 20 years ago. Like he literally said that. And then he even said like, maybe I'm immune. Just like saying.
Did you say maybe I'm invincible?
How are you supposed to be representing people? It makes no sense.
Oh, this is quite the week to be talking about conspiracy theories.
Hey, Mark, every week we have a little bit of a Trump discussion. It seems everything collapses back into Trump.
Everything comes back to capitalism, no matter what. It's always, I couldn't help while reading the book just think, so what you're telling me is the problem is capitalism.
Yeah, literally. Even the question that I asked, I was like, yeah, so like, how do we stop capitalism from just taking over this?
Do you know what is funny as well? In almost every class we have, there's these underlying themes. Like, yeah, capitalism is one of them, but then another one is looking at like individual theories versus considering like relationships with others and social aspects and contextual access and capitalism and yada yada yada. But Yeah.
But I agree with those themes. But I think they're good and important themes, and I'm glad that we end up kind of converging on scrutiny of these themes, because I think we're going in the right direction. But then again, we seem to often agree and maybe we're not paying attention to
I found the book really interesting, not solely in regards to the subject matter of misinformation or conspiracy theories, but more so about beliefs and values in general. So, like, misinformation is obviously a really hot topic at the moment, as is conspiracy theories, but just considering the social aspect of our beliefs and how that affects our values. Like, as you guys know, I'm interested in like non-human animal stuff and looking at like certain facts about, I don't know, whether it be animal sentience or whatever, and then looking at that, at how that results in behavior and action changes for people. So, like, rather than actually looking at the specific subject matter that the book was about, looking at just, because you look at epistemology in general, like in going back to like armchair philosophy and Descartes, and even through like skepticism of like Wittgenstein and Moore and whatever, it's all quite individual. And even like looking at the whole, like looking at justifying knowledge and the justified true belief stuff through the 20th century, like that's all really individual. So, and I haven't been exposed much to like social epistemology, so looking at it through that lens is really interesting.
Yeah, I think the social angle is quite valuable, and one of the cool things about Cailin's book is that she's not just thinking about sort of one person talking to one other person, but actually thinking about networks. Because of course that's how we actually learn from each other.
Yeah. Like, no, is there really any other way, you know? Like, it should have always been like this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the thing reading the book, I suppose, like, it was hard for me to almost come up with questions because it's just almost intuitive now that it's laid out before me. Like, now that I've read it, I'm kind of like, well, of course it's like that. That makes so much sense. But before, yeah.
But regardless of whether we're looking at epistemology or ethics or whatever, it's so much easier just to focus on the individual and like bracket out these contextual and environmental factors and all these other things that are at play. So I feel like that's obviously what's been done in so many areas for years, and now you're actually going, oh, there's all these other things. Like it's a much more complex problem. You can't just get rid of those things because it doesn't paint the full picture.
Yeah. So you think philosophy at least is moving in this direction? I mean, maybe you could tell us what you think, Mark. I mean, but there are still whole fields. I mean, the field of psychology that's based on identifying and diagnosing and pathologizing these individual quirks. Do you think that's still falling prey to like a limited view of things?
It's tricky. So to say where philosophy is moving is hard because I'm in the middle of it and I am trying to push things in a certain direction. Yeah. So obviously I'm going to want to say that things are moving in the direction that I like, which is more social. But I do think that there's certainly more attention being paid to social epistemology now than basically any time in the last century. Probably Miranda Fricker is the most responsible for that with her book on epistemic injustice, which just like almost started a whole subfield. But to speak about psychology is complicated because social psychology is where the replication crisis is sort of most centered, and personality psychology actually has been handling things much better. So you might think like, okay, well, really what we need is to say that there are individual characteristics that matter, and then there are all these social and structural things that also matter, and they interact with each other. And we shouldn't try to locate any of our analyses in just one of them or the other, but rather try to pay attention to both and to the interaction between them. Of course, once you start doing that, things become so hopelessly complex that it's hard to say anything substantive or falsifiable, but I think in the end, that's where we're going to end up.
I see.
So where does that leave democracy? Was Plato right all these years ago that most of us are quick to contribute?
I mean, so I will need to go in about 10 minutes, but to respond to that, I think one way to think about what's going on is related to what's sometimes called the Omnivores Dilemma. Has anybody come across this? So
I've heard of it, but I don't know.
Yeah, so the Omnivores Dilemma is basically, it's good to have as many food sources as possible, but the more food sources you have, the more chances you have of getting yourself infected or sick in some other way from the things that you eat. So humans seem to have evolved to have some people be sort of like really easy about eating anything that's put in front of them, and others being very fastidious and only eating things that they've tried before. And that suggests that it's not at the individual level that you need to analyze these traits, but rather at the group level. So what you want is a group where some people are willing to be sort of experimental and try new stuff, and maybe a few of them die. But others will not try new things, and if the new food turns out to be poisonous, they'll survive and keep the group alive. And I think in a way, belief might be like that, where we need some people who are sort of willing to change their minds easily, maybe even adopt conspiracy theories. And we need some people who are sort of very fastidious and don't change their minds easily. And it's only by having a group that trusts each other enough, where different individuals have different cognitive dispositions, that we're going to be able to sort of navigate our complex and ever-changing epistemic environment.
Yeah, that almost lines up with something that, like in the second chapter, Cailin's book, she's talking about like the need for alternative hypothesis in science. Like you've got to have someone that sort of steps outside the norm or the consensus to advance things.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's about the success of the group. And I mean, you said, Mark, that an individual maybe is more fastidious or more like lax about what they eat, but it could also be a group, right?
Yeah, so you could have multiple subgroups, some of which are more experimental and some of which are more sort of conservative.
Yeah, it seems like an analogy for liberals and conservatives, which is a good way to have a democracy. Like, you shouldn't just run into every change that becomes available. You do need to have thoughtful debate.
Yeah. Also, Mark, you probably know, but the first set of seminar sessions was with Pierre Hick, and he spoke to us about evolutionary theory and some kind of like quite innovative stuff that he's writing about, which is explaining levels of selection. Yeah, and there's this bias toward the individual, or at least that's the default view, but it's no more plausible than group explanations.
But wasn't he suspicious of group level selection?
Oh yeah, it was really hard.
So this is like the ongoing underlying thing, even with Jane's section, the second section, we were looking at biases toward the individual as opposed to relational.
So, I mean, we could say on the whole, like, maybe in different academic disciplines, there has been a social turn, right? Like, you know, look at human sciences, like linguistics. Like, I'm from a linguistics background, and there has been a huge shift from like cognitive linguistics and some of the assumptions and premises that come from that to, you know, the social context and relationality and blah, blah, blah. And I'm glad that you raised Miranda Fricker, Mark, because I think it's been, I think, the contribution of a lot of, or the result of the contribution from feminist philosophers and, you know, anti-racist critical philosophers that have maybe prompted this shift to relationality, like whether it be in ethics or epistemology. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's half the story. So at least in epistemology, the social turn is driven like half by people with social justice concerns, like feminist philosophers and anti-racist philosophers, but also half by people coming in from philosophy of science. And in a way, that's more where Cailin is coming from. So the social epistemology of science, using things like Bayesian network analysis, the sort of stuff that she does, has been going on sort of in the background for decades now. And people just didn't call it epistemology for a long time. They just said it was philosophy of science or something. And then, you know, Kevin Zollman, who was Cailin's advisor, and people like Cailin and people like Liam Kofi-Bright and various others were like, no, this is actually epistemology. Let's just call it what it is. And sometimes those concerns get put together. So like in Liam Kofi-Bright's stuff, there's a clear social justice angle and also a clear sort of quantitative modeling angle. But in some cases, it's more just the pure quantitative stuff. That's most of Kevin Zollman's work, or like Eric Olson's work. And then there's also people like Fricker who don't do any of the quantitative stuff and are more just interested in like the social justice angle.
Yeah, but I think they could work together, right? Like the quantitative stuff from the philosophy of science could lend itself to a social justice orientation, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're not inconsistent with each other. They're just different approaches or mindsets that you might start from.
Have you given out this Zoom link to your next class as well?
Yes.
Is that why there's people jumping in?
Yeah, I noticed like random people keep popping up, and I was like,
oh, do they?
No.
I was unable to figure out how to use the other Zoom links, so I just used this one, which is like my personal Macquarie.
Equivalent. Oh.
So
no other tutor has done that yet.
okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, you said it was your first time using Zoom as a host, so I wouldn't know how to do it either.
Was this okay? Was this more
Yeah.
or less?
Yeah, really good.
More than okay.
Okay.
You're the one up at 2 a.m. So is it okay for you?
Yeah, so in the few minutes before the next class starts, do you have any feedback for next time? Would you like things conducted differently, or do you want to do things in some other way, or yeah, anything like that?
I really like how this class has flowed. Like generally, like with this group, we kind of don't seem to have a set agenda, but the conversation flows really well throughout. So I like how we've done today.
Yeah, it was good.
Okay. Hopefully next time I'll be Skyping you from Adelaide, but my last 4 flights have been canceled, so I have no idea.
Mark, my dad has been trying to come back since June, and he's still stuck. So he's in some similar situation as you. He's in Iran. But yeah, since June, they've just been canceling his flights. He's meant to have a flight on the 12th, which again, he's not optimistic about. He had a flight on the 12th, and then also a backup one on the 25th. They've cancelled his 25th one already. the 12th one, he has to go to the airport and see whether it's going to fly or not.
That's the same date as Mark's one.
So,
Right?
yeah.
Okay, I'll cross my fingers for you.
Thanks.
Good luck.
Okay. Okay, it's been great to sort of get to know you a little bit. I'm sorry that we're not in person, but looking forward to next week. And if you have any thoughts about how we can do things better, feel free to shoot me an email or post something in the discussion forum.
We just received an email saying a student at Macquarie campus has just got COVID. So
great.
it's probably not such a bad thing that we're not in person.
Got nothing to worry about. Trump said.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. Need to stop it.
All right, I've got to run quickly, but I'll see everyone at 11.
See you.
Okay.
See ya. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
See you guys.
Thanks.